A 2,000-year-old cloth, a mysterious face, and DNA evidence that could change everything we know about history's most controversial relic. What scientists just discovered about the Shroud of Turin will absolutely shock you. Picture this: you're looking at a piece of linen that might have touched the most famous person in human history. For centuries, people have argued about whether this cloth really wrapped Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. But now, cutting-edge DNA science has uncovered secrets hidden in these ancient fibers. Stay until the end, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you think about this mystery. The Shroud of Turin is not just any piece of cloth. This 14-foot-long linen bears the faint but unmistakable image of a crucified man. The image shows wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion, nail marks in the wrists and feet, marks from a crown of thorns, and what appears to be a spear wound in the side. For over 600 years, this shroud has been one of Christianity's most sacred relics. Millions of believers consider it the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ. But skeptics have long argued it's nothing more than a clever medieval forgery created by artists to fool pilgrims. The debate has raged for centuries, but here's where it gets interesting. Modern science has given us tools that medieval forgers never could have anticipated. DNA analysis can now tell us secrets that the naked eye could never reveal. Scientists realized they could extract genetic material from the cloth itself. And what they found has turned this ancient mystery into a modern scientific thriller. Let me take you back to the beginning of scientific investigation into the shroud. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers first started studying the cloth using modern methods. They found pollen grains from plants that grow in the Middle East. They discovered traces of limestone dust consistent with Jerusalem's geology. But the real breakthrough came when scientists realized they could look for DNA evidence. The problem was that early DNA technology wasn't sensitive enough to work with such old, degraded samples. Think about it. If this cloth is really 2,000 years old, any genetic material would be incredibly fragmented and damaged. It would be like trying to read a book that's been torn into millions of tiny pieces and scattered to the wind. For years, researchers could only find plant DNA and traces of dust and pollen. The human DNA, if it existed at all, seemed to be beyond the reach of science. But technology keeps advancing, and by the 2000s, DNA sequencing became incredibly powerful. Scientists developed new techniques that could detect genetic material from just a few cells. This opened up entirely new possibilities for studying the shroud. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. Using these advanced techniques, researchers began finding something extraordinary: actual human DNA embedded in the shroud's fibers. We're not talking about just one person's DNA. Multiple studies have now identified genetic material from several different individuals. Scientists found DNA in blood traces, in microscopic skin cells, and even in hair follicles trapped in the weave of the cloth. But here's the crucial question: whose DNA is it? The genetic analysis revealed something remarkable. Some of the DNA shows markers consistent with Middle Eastern populations. These are genetic signatures you'd expect to find in people from the region around Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, but that's not all. The DNA analysis also revealed European genetic markers. This makes sense when you consider the shroud's documented history. For centuries, it was handled by European monks, researchers, and pilgrims. People touched it, kissed it, and even cut small pieces from it for study. So now scientists faced a complex puzzle. They had to figure out which DNA was ancient, possibly from the original burial, and which was contamination from centuries of human contact. Some researchers claim they've identified DNA that's consistent with Jewish populations from the time of Christ. Others point to genetic evidence suggesting the presence of people from various Mediterranean regions throughout history. But here's where things get really complicated. DNA analysis of ancient artifacts is incredibly tricky. Unlike DNA from a fresh crime scene, ancient genetic material is degraded, fragmented, and often contaminated. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and someone has mixed in pieces from dozens of other puzzles. That's what scientists face when analyzing DNA from the Shroud. Every person who ever touched the cloth left behind microscopic traces of their DNA. Every breath, every kiss, every gentle touch added more genetic material to the mix. Over 600 years of documented history, thousands of people have come into contact with this cloth. Scientists have to use incredibly sophisticated techniques to try to separate truly ancient DNA from more recent contamination. They look for specific degradation patterns that indicate age. They search for genetic markers that suggest different time periods and geographical origins. Some researchers claim they've found DNA that shows signs of extreme age and degradation consistent with 2,000-year-old samples. Others argue that it's impossible to definitively separate ancient DNA from medieval or modern contamination. Now here's where the story takes an absolutely mind-bending turn. Some of the most recent DNA analysis has revealed genetic evidence that nobody expected. Researchers found traces of plant DNA from species that grow specifically in the Jerusalem area. But not just any plants, species that were commonly used in ancient Jewish burial practices. We're talking about aloes, myrrh, and other plants mentioned in historical accounts of first-century burial customs. Even more shocking, some studies claim to have found ancient pathogen DNA genetic traces of bacteria and other microorganisms that would have been present on a body that had been crucified and buried according to Jewish customs of the time. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Some researchers say they've identified Y chromosome DNA genetic material that passes directly from father to son. If this DNA is truly ancient, it could potentially provide genetic information about the male individual who was wrapped in this cloth. However, and this is crucial, other scientists strongly dispute these findings. They argue that the DNA evidence is too contaminated and degraded to draw any definitive conclusions about ancient origins. So, what does all this DNA evidence actually mean? Well, that depends on who you ask. Believers point to the Middle Eastern genetic markers as proof that the Shroud wrapped someone from first-century Palestine. They argue that the plant DNA and pathogen evidence supports the historical account of Jesus' burial. Skeptics counter that medieval forgers could have used authentic Middle Eastern materials to create a convincing fake. They point out that the Shroud traveled extensively through regions where Middle Eastern DNA could have easily contaminated the cloth. Some scientists take a middle ground. They acknowledge that the DNA evidence shows the Shroud has an incredibly complex history involving people from multiple regions and time periods. But they argue that current technology cannot definitively determine when specific DNA samples were deposited on the cloth. The debate has become so intense that different laboratories have produced conflicting results. Some claim to have found ancient DNA, while others insist that all the genetic material is relatively recent. Where does this leave us? The DNA evidence has opened up new research avenues, but hasn't provided clear answers many hoped for. Even if scientists could prove 2,000-year-old DNA exists on this cloth, it still wouldn't prove whose body it wrapped. DNA can tell us about geographical origins and age, but not someone's identity. The Shroud remains one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. The DNA evidence adds new pieces to this puzzle, but the complete picture stays elusive. So, what do you think? Does the DNA evidence make you believe the Shroud is authentic? Or raise more questions? If you found this evidence fascinating, subscribe and hit that notification bell for more scientific mysteries. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. The Shroud of Turin and its DNA secrets continue to be one of history's most captivating mysteries.